Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today's session is on the theme of rebranding Gandhi in Modi's India. So, the subtitle is Reimagining the Mahatma's Education Vision at UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Peace and Sustainable Development, that is MGIEP, in Delhi. And the speaker is Professor Edward Vickers, who is a UNESCO Chair in Education for Peace, Social Justice, and Global Citizenship at Kyushu University, Japan. And he's also president of the Comparative Education Society of Asia. He will be formally introduced by Dr. Muhammad Javed Hussain, who is assistant professor of science education at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. And as far as the summary bio of Dr. Javed Hussain says, that he was also at Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad, as well as Azim Premji University, Bangalore, Central Institute of Education, University of Delhi, and State Institute of Education and Training, NCRT, Delhi. His research interests are on studying science and science education from an interdisciplinary perspective. So, welcome you all, and now I invite Dr. Javed Hussain Saab for the formal introduction. Javed Saab.
Thank you, Razi Saab. Good evening to everyone in India, and I think it's good morning for USA and midnight in Japan. So at the outset, I congratulate Dr. Raziuddin Sahab for organizing a talk on education, which has been a more or less marginalized area in the social sciences. I have been entrusted with the pleasant task of introducing Professor Edward Vickers and introducing today's talk. So, normally, an international scholar like Edward should not need any introduction. However, given the diversity of Indian diaspora's audience, let me briefly introduce Professor Edward Vickers, who is an important critical voice in today's limiting educational spaces. He helps us to be careful about what looks charming in education, but is actually complex and in certain ways counterproductive also. Well, Edward is a professor of comparative education at the Kyushu University, Fukuoka, Japan. He is also the director of Kyushu Taiwan Studies Program and holds the UNESCO Chair on Education for Peace, Social Justice, and Global Citizenship. He is also the president of the Comparative Education Society of Asia and a core member of the War Memory Spaces in Asia partnership. Also, he is the co-editor of the East Asian Journal of Popular Culture. In India, we had the benefit of listening to Edward's keynote address in the prestigious Comparative Education Society of India's conference held at Punjab University, Chandigarh, last year in November, where he spoke on a very important topic, the global politics of education. His research interests revolved around the contemporary history of education in Chinese societies, with a particular focus on the role of schools and other public institutions in political socialization. Furthermore, he conducts comparative research on portrayals of foreign others through schooling and other media in the societies of East Asia. And he has recently been involved in coordinating a project looking at portrayals of Japan in other East Asian societies. Edward teaches a variety of undergraduate and postgraduate courses related to comparative and international education, including a postgraduate seminar on China's education system. He is also involved in the Asia Joint Degree Project run by Tohoku University, of which he is an external auditor. I shall now quickly mention his 5 key publications, which includes an edited book with Indian educationist Professor Krishna Kumar, titled Constructing Modern Asian Citizenship, published by Routledge, New York, 2015. Edward Vickers wrote another book with Paul Morris titled Imagining Japan in Post-War Asia, Identity, Politics, Schooling, and Popular Culture. Again, Routledge, 2013. Another book of Edwards, which was published by Oxford in 2009, is with another international professor of education, Professor Mary Lal, and it is titled Education as a Political Tool in Asia. Edward has another book with Elisa Jones to his credit, which is titled History, Education, and National Identity in East Asia, 2005. And another book by Edwards is In Search of an Identity, The Politics of History as a School Subject in Hong Kong. Let me now briefly contextualize today's talk, which has been titled Reimagining the Mahatma's Educational Vision at UNESCO MGIEP in Delhi. In 2009, the UNESCO General Conference decided to set up an institute focused on education about sustainable development in the Asia-Pacific region. So in 2012, the former Director General of UNESCO and the former President of India, Pranab Mukherjee, launched the MGIEP in Delhi. MGIP is now a UNESCO Research Institute for Asia Pacific, and it enjoys the status of being the first and only Category 1 research institute in Asia Pacific. As most of you know, the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all UN members in 2015, created 17 World Sustainable Development Goals. And the MGIEP focuses on achieving these SDGs, particularly SDG 4.7, which says towards education to foster peaceful and sustainable societies. So Edward's experiences of working with MGIEP and his training in the history and cultural politics of education, I think it makes him a perfect speaker for using MGIEP as an example to discuss how multilateral organizations like the OECD and the UNESCO significantly influence or legitimize the educational policy goals of several national governments. Consequently, state actors are often keen to enhance their own influence within these organizations or otherwise manipulate them for their own political ends. So Edward's recent work particularly helps us in understanding how UNESCO has been depoliticizing or neutralizing efforts related to global citizenship education and has been rather focusing on STEM education, AI in education, EdTech, and aspects of social and emotional learning. So kind of what has been termed as learnification or psychologization of education. So I hope Edward shall also be able to compare India's participation concerning UNESCO and speculate on implications for the educational initiatives of multilateral agencies in light of the recent political developments in the USA. So thank you. We look forward to Edward's discussions. Thank you, and over to you, Edwards.
Well, thank you very much, Joyd. Thanks for that very generous and flattering introduction. And thank you to Dr. Raziuddin for inviting me to speak to this forum. It's a wonderful opportunity. In my vanity, I'd just like to sort of mention a couple of publications, more recent publications of mine. One of which I'll say something about shortly. It's the first report that I did for the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. In fact, the report that wasn't as traumatic as the other one I'll be talking about, it's called Rethinking Schooling for the 21st Century, which came out in 2017, which I was involved in writing with Krishna Kumar and Yoko Mochizuki, and that can be downloaded freely on the internet from the UNESCO website. I work mainly on East Asia rather than South Asia, although I obviously do some work on South Asia. And within East Asia, most of my work focuses on China. So another book that I wrote or published in 2017 is this one, Education and Society in Post-War, post-Mao China. So I don't know if any of you are interested in China. That book is also available, or should be available, from all good bookshops, but you may find isn't. Right, without further ado, I'll get on with my talk and share the slides here. Right, is that working okay?
Yes.
Great. So, as Joyd mentioned, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute is, or rather was, the first, was the first Category 1 UNESCO institute to be established in Asia. But it's no longer the only one. There's an International Institute for STEM that's going to open very soon in China, in Shanghai. So finally, there's going to be a second Category 1 UNESCO institute in Asia. Now, I worked with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, or MGIEP, from 2016 until 2022 on two major projects. The first one, which resulted in the book that I just waved in front of you on the screen, I was brought in to work on that on the recommendation of Professor Krishna Kumar, who a number of you may have heard of, the former head of India's National Council for Educational Research and Training, who at the time had just retired from Delhi University and was doing a short stint as a research associate at MGIEP. And like Professor Kumar, I assumed, somewhat naively as it turned out, that MGIEP's work would on some level be informed by Gandhian ideals or principles. Like him, though, I quickly came to realize that the Institute was moving in a direction quite radically incompatible with those principles. So to understand why MGIEP took such a direction, I think it's important, first of all, to understand certain things about India's larger educational and political landscape. So I'll say a little about that, and hopefully it won't, it will probably involve going over some issues that many of you are already familiar with, but I'll spend a little time discussing them nonetheless. It's also important, though, to understand some certain things about the broader situation within which UNESCO finds itself. So I'll start by saying a little about that. UNESCO is the UN organization that is supposed to offer expertise and advice on educational matters, amongst other things, of course. World heritage, science policy, etc. But education falls under UNESCO's remit. But over recent decades, it's struggled to compete for attention or for influence over what many call global educational governance with other multilateral organizations, especially the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris. Whereas the OECD has always emphasized education's contribution to economic growth, UNESCO's traditionally embraced a much broader, more humanistic vision that pays attention to education's relationship with the social and cultural context. But because that vision of education is rather more complex than the OECD's, it's relatively hard to communicate or to explain, especially to busy policymakers who like spreadsheets and 30-second quotes. Also, focusing on how education interacts with society and politics can raise questions that are uncomfortable for social and political elites. And while the OECD has a lot of funding to support its work, UNESCO struggles to attract funding from its key donors. Not least because for most of the last 15 years, the United States has not been paying into UNESCO's budget. For the last 2 years it has, but it looks very likely that the United States is once again going to withdraw under the Trump presidency. For these reasons, UNESCO has increasingly found itself drawn towards the sort of depoliticized, narrowly skills-focused educational agenda that we associate more with the OECD. And increasingly, that skills agenda has included a focus, and Jawid just mentioned this, a focus on what are nowadays termed social and emotional skills, or what the OECD calls 21st century competencies. This is part of the background to the story of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute. But another crucial element involves the political situation within India today. Since 2014, as you know, India's national government's been dominated by the Hindu fundamentalist BJP. And the BJP has steadily sought to extend political control over various aspects of India's education system, although its power to do this remains limited by India's federal system of government. But in public universities that fall under the central government's remit, for example, BJP supporters have been appointed to key posts, and decisions on appointments and promotions are increasingly made on grounds of ideology or party loyalty. Curricular content and all sorts of academic activities have been subject to increasingly stringent surveillance and control. With respect to schooling, primary or secondary, many Indian states have long struggled to attract and retain and train competent teachers for public schools. But the current national government's response to these long-standing challenges has been to push through a standardized national curriculum for teacher education with an extremely narrow technical focus. This implies a deprofessionalized vision of public school teachers really as lowly public functionaries obediently delivering a predetermined educational agenda. In other words, not treating them as autonomous, responsible professionals. At the same time, the children of elite Indian families almost all attend English medium private schools that fall outside the government's control. So India has an extremely divided and unequal education system, with most wealthy or powerful families pretty much disinvested in the public schooling system because that's not where they're sending their children. The Indian government's 2020 national education policy envisages heightened command and control over state schools and teachers, a narrow focus on skills and STEM, and a greater role for private enterprise in educational provision. And that, as many observers have noted, is likely to worsen India's stark educational divides, with elite kids in expensive private schools prepped for entry to prestigious colleges, while masses a much more narrow curriculum focused on basic literacy and numeracy and little else. The NEP also encourages diversion of students into a vocational stream from the end of primary school. That proposal was condemned by Krishna Kumar, who said that it runs the risk of resuscitating entrenched hierarchies, especially at a time when unemployment is high, traditional livelihoods are under severe strain, and the mindless adoption of new technologies is de-skilling people. Kumar also condemned the failure to reform India's notoriously narrow, high-stakes system of public examinations. The current government seems happy to maintain this since, as Kumar puts it, these exams can handle and hide social disparities by upholding the regime of merit. As well as envisaging an enhanced role for the private sector, the NEP also hails the transformative potential of educational technology. Worship of the market and enthusiasm for digital technology tend to go hand in hand, especially in India with its very large tech sector. And that conjunction is largely due, of course, to the profits to be made from expanding use of expensive technological equipment. But the NEP was promulgated in the middle of 2020. In other words, just as the flaws of both the educational market and digital technology were being brutally exposed by the COVID-19 lockdowns in India. Thousands of cheap private schools went bust during the pandemic, leaving countless students with no educational provision at all for the best part of 18 months. Most Indian schools remain closed for, as I said, over a year, forcing classes online. Inequalities in access to digital technology left vast swathes of the student population cut off from schooling of any sort, a problem which, as many have observed, especially affected girls. Alongside all of this is the core of the current government's agenda. It's Hindu nationalism. A chauvinistic outlook and a vision of citizenship premised on an uncritical loyalty to the state, and the state conceived as a predominantly Hindu entity, is implicit in the civic values that the NEP emphasizes. As Anita Rampal, a former dean of Delhi University's education department, pointed out, the policy's guiding principles invariably prioritize duties, discipline, and order over rights, equity, and justice. As it aims to promote passive loyalty to the BJP's nationalist vision of Indian identity, the government is seeking to strip the school curriculum of any elements that might promote a more active and critical form of citizenship. In April 2023, therefore, significant changes were announced to NCERT, National Council for Educational Research and Training, textbooks. These included removing references to Darwin's theory of evolution from books used by students in the compulsory years up to junior secondary level, removing from history textbooks references to the Mughals and to other Muslim regimes and historical figures, altering the account of the life and ideas of Mahatma Gandhi in political science textbooks so as to delete mention of his opposition to Hindu supremacist visions of India, removal from textbooks of portions dealing with problems such as social inequality or caste, and removal from geography textbooks of sections discussing aspects of the climate emergency in India and elsewhere. Well, it's something else very reminiscent of things that are going on in Trump's America at the moment, I believe. These cuts to textbooks were justified publicly as a means of rationalizing the curriculum to reduce the burden on learners. In other words, we're just cutting volume to reduce the pressure on little children's brains. But these changes are basically part of a drive to reinforce a traditional top-down didactic form of pedagogy consistent with the BJP's emphasis on discipline and control. They're seeking to instill pride in a monolithically Hindu vision of Indian civilization represented as pure, unique, and unpolluted by foreign elements. This new injection of ideology into the state school curriculum is likely to further accelerate the trend for wealthier Indians to opt out of the public system entirely and instead send their children to expensive private or international schools. And that, of course, accentuates the fracturing of Indian society, with narrow indoctrination prescribed for the masses, while elites can ensure their children get a relatively broad and stimulating liberal education. Thrown into this mix of ideology, intense competition, and chronic inequality is another ingredient that has a special bearing on the work of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute, and that is the fashion for social and emotional learning, or SEL. High-stakes public examinations are one way in which, as Krishna Kumar puts it, India's governing elites can handle and hide social disparities by upholding the regime of merit. But another way of managing the stresses caused by social injustice is to try to turn the focus inward on the individual. Well, as indeed a focus on merit does too, but to turn the focus inward on the individual by portraying stress, anxiety, insecurity, and so forth as essentially psychological rather than social pathologies. So social and emotional learning is all part of the sort of trend to psychologize education that Joaid mentioned earlier when he was introducing me. This is another theme of the 2020 National Education Policy. But this psychologizing turn is not unique to India. As William Davies, who's a British scholar, writes in his book, The Happiness Industry, psychology is very often how societies avoid looking in the mirror. For this reason, SEL has become increasingly popular with political and corporate elites around the world, not least in the USA. The idea of SEL as a package of teachable skills fostering adaptability and resilience. Resilience is a word we hear a lot these days. That idea features in many educational reports produced today by the OECD, UNESCO, and various national governments. In India, the psychologizing discourses of SEL maybe hold a particular appeal or plausibility for many, because meditation and mindfulness are seen as especially associated with Hinduism. In fact, mindfulness techniques have come to be seen as a major Indian export, as witnessed by the success in America of Sadhguru's message of inner engineering. What's all that about? Maybe someone can explain. And within India, it's not just Hindu fundamentalists who are attracted to a psychological approach to solving social problems. In Delhi, the city government, well, actually the former city government, because I believe Ahmed Admi just lost the election. The former city government has run a happy schools program that seeks to spread the benefits of positive thinking to children from poor communities. And I'm sure some of you can think of other things that might be of more concrete assistance to children from poor communities. It's important to stress that SEL covers a broad range of ideas and activities, some of which may be good and worthwhile. But it's often associated with a depoliticized, psychologizing approach to fostering pro-social behavior, as it's called, that is dangerous as well as ineffective. Among the governments most enthusiastic about SEL are those with the strongest reasons for distracting their citizens from social injustice and political oppression. In societies that suffer from extreme inequality, chronic insecurity, and intense competition, it's much easier to blame social tensions on individual maladjustment than to draw attention to structural, institutional, social, political causes of injustice. Defenders of the political and economic status quo tend to be attracted to a vision of education that sees it as a matter of adapting individuals to society as it is, rather than helping them critically to understand social problems and then potentially to challenge their root causes. The aims of education and the social order it should serve are therefore often portrayed as matters of settled consensus, and schools' effectiveness in yielding crucial outcomes as readily susceptible to quantitative measurement. All that's needed then is for technocrats, economists, and scientists to use the evidence to tell us what works without scrutinizing too deeply, what the end of this working is, what the ultimate goal of education is or should be. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll be focusing especially on the appeal of social and emotional learning, or SEL, in the light of my experience with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute in Delhi. Now, as I mentioned already, until 2023, MGIP was Asia's only Category 1 UNESCO institute. And this was a point of pride for India's government, which provides the institute's core funding and appoints the chair of its governing board. And that has meant that, given that MGIEP, officially it started in 2012, as Javed mentioned, although it didn't really get going until 2014. So for pretty much the whole of its existence, the Indian government has been a BJP government. So the chair of the governing board of MGIEP has been a BJP appointee. Well, no, the first chair of the governing board actually was not, but as soon as his term ended, the next appointee was a BJP appointee. So the remit of the Institute is education for peace and sustainable development. And that's closely aligned with one of the key targets of the UN Sustainable Development Goals for education, which calls for education for peace, sustainable development, and global citizenship. It also reflects core concerns of UNESCO's long-standing educational agenda, which, as I've mentioned, has traditionally stressed a more humanistic, less narrowly technocratic vision of education's purposes than, for example, the OECD. As we'll see, though, the work of the Mahatma Gandhi Institute marks a rather radical departure from UNESCO's humanistic ideals. And what of the Institute's alignment with the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi? Gandhi, as we all know, was a pacifist, deeply engaged with the political and social problems of his day. So, if he were still with us today, we can imagine he'd be alarmed, though probably not surprised, by the violence and discrimination that still plague our world. He would see the global environmental crisis as fulfilling his warnings about the dangers of machine civilization, and he would undoubtedly be urging direct but peaceful political action to bring about urgent social change. Gandhi would certainly see inculcating a moral outlook conducive to this sort of active and politically aware citizenship as a key task of education. And for those reasons, we might expect MGIEP to be dealing with these sorts of issues. But, of course, India's current governing party, the BJP, has never had any enthusiasm for Gandhi's ideas. Gandhi promoted a tolerant, multi-faith vision of India, whereas the BJP stands for Hindu supremacy and basically views Muslims and Christians as aliens. Moves to establish the Mahatma Gandhi Institute actually began under the previous Congress-led administration in the early 2000s, when India was competing with China to secure Asia's first Category 1 institute. And, the story of how they won that, India 1, China 0 is another story. The plan was always to name the institute in honor of Gandhi, and its focus on education for peace and sustainable development, of course, certainly chimes with his ideals. And in its early days, in the mid-2010s, so up until the time, more or less, when I first started becoming involved with it, the institute was actually engaged in some critical analysis of the politics of education and its implications for peace and social justice. I mentioned from 2016 to 2017, Krishna Kumar and I worked with Yoko Mochizuki, co-authoring a critical report for MGIEP on the state of education for peace, sustainable development, and global citizenship in Asia. But it was already clear then that that report jarred with the agenda of the Institute's former director. So these are a couple of pictures from the launch event of that report. You know, they say photos never lie, but sometimes they do. It wasn't a very friendly occasion, I'm given to understand. The former director was not really particularly happy with the contents of that report, or rather with the way that Professor Kumar presented it. Anyway, under his leadership, MGIEP increasingly promoted the line that science and technology hold the solutions to all social or educational problems. Science and technology hold the solutions to all social and educational problems. I mean, it's hard to imagine any claim further from, you know, sort of Gandhian ideals. When the Institute invokes Gandhi at all, it portrays him as a sort of mindfulness champion. So I'm sure you know how skeptical Gandhi was of technology, but MGIEP has been a fervent cheerleader for neuroscience, AI, and educational technology. Prominent advocates of psychological or technology-driven approaches to education have sat on its governing board, and the former director was a technological enthusiast who advocated a personalized approach to education that, in his words, would pair a bot with every child from an early age. So he sort of fantasized about having a sort of AI generated kind of pedagogical guardian angel for every child, which is a sort of weird sci-fi fantasy you can mull over. This embrace of neuroscience and psychology is encapsulated in the Institute's current slogan, building kinder brains. Now, Gandhi himself condemned approaches to education that, as he put it, stimulated the brain but starved the spirit and emaciated the body. But MGIEP sees interfering with our brains as the secret to promoting so-called pro-social behavior. The former director has spoken of triggering Gandhi neurons. I should make clear, Gandhi neurons are an entity unknown to science. Anyway, triggering Gandhi neurons through psychological manipulation and mindfulness techniques, and measuring the effects of educational interventions through brain scans or psychological evaluation. So, yeah, here are the covers of a couple of issues of the Institute's in-house magazine. Oh, there's only one cover. Anyway, that gives you the idea. So the in-house magazine for years sort of basically featured brains on every cover. And on one occasion, he got MRI scans of literally the brains of all the MGIEP staff and put them on the back cover of the in-house magazine for some reason. The Institute commemorated the 150th anniversary of Gandhi's birth by having a hologram of the Mahatma, there he is on stage in Paris, deliver speeches on the importance of kindness. If you're my sort of age, it might remind you very much of this. And sometimes the techno-solutionism and neuromania, as we might call it, is really just bizarre and quite hard to fathom. As with the cover images for the second MGIEP report that I helped to write, this one, Flying Brains in Space. So that's the Reimagining Education Report, the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. But the output of MGIEP seems attractive to many of the non-education specialists in senior positions within UNESCO and to many corporate and political elites in India and elsewhere. There are basically two reasons for this attraction. Firstly, a focus on brains trains our attention on individuals rather than on the messy and complex social, political, and cultural context in which they have to live and work. In fact, it basically disregards ethical and cultural and political complexity, instead seeing citizens as atomized consumers and producers. So again, William Davies, author of The Happiness Industry, calls this the neuroeconomic prejudice. Secondly, this approach comes with the appearance of science, of hard, quantifiable, evidence-based data from laboratory experiments conducted by white-coated experts. It claims to be based on reliable, experimentally tested data, in contrast to the fluffy uncertainty of the social sciences and humanities, which are just opinion. There's a third attraction to this emphasis on science and evidence, which is that anything that can be counted and measured can be priced and costed. Psychological manipulation is also central to the commercial success of many internet-based apps and the corporations that produce them, not least, things like Facebook. So it's no surprise that the promise of a psychologized science of learning attracts generous corporate funding and powerful political support. These neuroeconomic or neuroliberal assumptions loomed large in that other major MGIEP project on which I worked from 2020 to 2022, the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. This was promoted as a multidisciplinary effort modeled on the UN's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of the early 2000s. And the MGIEP leadership saw it as yielding definitive conclusions on what works in education. I was asked to coordinate a working group on the contexts of education, which I agreed to do, partly in the hope that it would provide an opportunity to explain to the scientists involved what the complexities of politics and culture imply for education and why it's important to take account of political and social and cultural context when we consider educational issues. But that's not how the project played out. The neuroscientists on the team were always listened to with respectful, humble attention by MGIEP's management. But for us social scientists, it was a constant struggle to gain any hearing for a critical analysis of the social, political, and cultural context for education. Indeed, several quite eminent social scientists who'd initially agreed to be involved in the project swiftly abandoned it because of the disdain with which they were treated by some of the neuroscientists and by the Institute's leadership. The attitude of the MGIP director is nicely captured by these comments he gave on a podcast interview in 2022. So here he is, complaining about the difficulties of working with social scientists, these idiots who just want to sort of burden us with their opinions. Let me tell you, it was not easy. There was so much mistrust. Many of these social scientists were questioning, why are the neuroscientists here? What has the brain got to do with learning? And I was like, what? Hello? This is where it all happens. And they have some fascinating things to share with the education community. And they were working in the field of education anyway. Well, which is questionable, because they weren't working in the field of education, actually. They were working in what they call the science of learning, which is basically all about how brains respond to particular stimuli, which is something rather different from education. Anyway, that's what we were up against. In our context section of the report, we emphasized the complex influence of culture, politics, and economics on educational policy and practice. We stressed the limitations of a narrowly economistic approach to education and the dangers of excessive reliance on quantitative metrics in educational governance. We made the sorts of points I've just been making in relation to India on meritocracy, educational competition, economic insecurity, and the threat of nationalist extremism. But none of those points featured in the summary for decision makers that MGIEP published. The key findings, and incidentally, they published the summary for decision makers before we'd actually finalized our working group papers on context. So much for the evidence-based approach. The key findings that they highlighted included the importance of whole brain, learner-centric education, whatever that is, and a right to personalized learning. Meanwhile, the MGIEP leadership published an article under the names of all of us involved in authoring the report, praising the Indian government's 2020 NEP as a shining example of policy guided by science and evidence. Where can this sort of fetishization of digital technology and neuroscience or psychology lead? When it comes to psychology and the fostering of social and emotional learning, sentiments like confidence, gratitude, kindness, or happiness can, of course, seem superficially attractive, especially when discussed in the abstract and with no regard for context. But programs promoting happiness amongst poor children in Delhi, or inner engineering, or gratitude education amongst young people in, let's say, Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang, which is projects that have been going on, or kinder brains. Essentially, these sorts of things set out to tell us that we shouldn't look to states or collective public action to solve the world's problems. And they're also telling us that if young people are unhappy with aspects of their lives, the problem's in their heads, not out there in the world around them. In other words, we as individuals just need to be kind enough and happy enough, and like Bill and Ted, excellent to each other. And this is sold as a message of empowerment. But actually, it disempowers us by preventing us from understanding how power actually works in our societies. It's the political dimension that's typically missing from programs of social and emotional learning. Without that political dimension, social and emotional learning becomes essentially a means of pacifying citizens to prevent them questioning the existing social order. A recent study of gratitude education programs directed at Palestinian youngsters in Israel, for example, talks of effective governmentality through gratitude. Effective governmentality basically means controlling people through manipulating their emotions. And effective governmentality also goes hand in hand with a neoliberal drive to shrink the state and withdraw public welfare guarantees. This is because persuading us that our sentiments or emotions have some sort of transformative power encourages, as the report on the Palestinians puts it, encourages the privatization of social problems and the psychologization of inequality. The widespread talk today of social and emotional skills or competencies is disturbing because it changes the meaning of some key values or sentiments. So, for example, I was recently asked to review a research proposal by a Hong Kong-based scholar who wanted to argue that non-cognitive skills such as gratitude should be valued because they could contribute to academic success as measured by examinations. So if we can get students to feel more grateful, they'll get better marks in their exams. That's the hypothesis. But talking of gratitude as a skill implies a deeply instrumental view of children as learning machines that will operate more efficiently and cause less social disruption if they can have this useful bit of ethical software installed. But what is gratitude, in fact? It's a sentiment informed by beliefs concerning what we owe to others in our families or our communities or the wider world, and what they owe to us. So before we talk about whether or how to prime young people to feel grateful, we ought to ask what they have to be grateful for. In South Asia, where MGIEP operates, problems of poverty and inequality intersect with divisions of caste, religion, and ethnicity, and of course gender, offering opportunities for entrepreneurs of communal hatred to spread their message. Precisely because of such injustices and social tensions, it suits established elites to use the ideology of meritocracy to persuade poor people that their poverty is their fault. And that's why Krishna Kumar criticizes India's NEP for hiding social disparities by using the regime of merit. And of course, this is a pattern that's far from unique to India. In his book, The Meritocracy Trap, the Princeton scholar Daniel Markovits argues that intense educational competition in the United States today reduces even privileged children to entrepreneurs of their own human capital. This pervasive competitiveness is utterly alienating for everyone. And incidentally, Markovits is, in his book, The Meritocracy Trap, is partly setting out to try and explain, some of the issues behind the rise of Trump. So, I mean, it's alienating for everyone, but especially for less privileged people, many of whom, of course, in America are Trump voters, who can never hope to win the race for credentials. In this situation, promoting social and emotional learning, brain science, or AI as keys to solving our social problems is, at best, naive. Talk of using brain science and emotional manipulation to produce a society of content, compliant citizens should be something we find chilling as soon as we hear it discussed. It's a vision of deadening pacification rather than of a humane, just, and sustainable social order. Building kinder brains should remind us of something out of Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel, Brave New World. An alternative vision that's one I forgot about. An alternative is a vision of education that prizes learning intrinsically for its own sake. This is something that UNESCO has traditionally championed. But in a context of pervasive insecurity, that sort of educational agenda seems like an utterly unrealistic dream. It's hard to imagine most parents in India today or anywhere else prioritizing free, exploratory learning. In their desperation to acquire or maintain economic security, they have good reasons for pushing their kids towards careers in engineering, finance, or medicine, and therefore treating education as a very sort of narrowly examination-oriented enterprise. Realizing a more humanistic vision of education would require reducing the insecurity that drives desperate competition for a narrow set of educational credentials. And this means, well, anywhere. This means looking hard at our welfare and taxation regimes and our labor markets. If we don't do this, and if inequality continues to grow and competitive pressures to intensify, then we'll face escalating tensions within all our societies, and that will further tempt elite or established powers to distract us from these tensions with technological solutionism, pop psychology, and paranoid nationalism. We hear a lot from UNESCO, the OECD, and national policymakers about the so-called transformative power of education. And of course, education is extremely important for all sorts of reasons, not least for how it affects the way that we relate to each other as fellow citizens of our national societies and of the world. But when we look at the incredibly competitive and narrow character of the education that so many children experience today, I think we need to rethink our emphasis when it comes to talking about transformation. Rather than simply looking at education as a way of transforming citizens to make them more productive, resilient, and socially adaptive, we need to think more about how to transform our societies in order to make a different, better, more sustainable and humane vision of education possible. That's the sort of debate that UNESCO, with its humanistic traditions, should be leading. But as the example of MGIEP shows, that's not what we see happening right now. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Such a fascinating talk. We learned a lot really today. Hardly I didn't know what Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Peace is doing. And obviously it is under a different regime. It is doing something totally opposite to it. Unfortunately, we do not have a concluding remarks. Dr. Latika is away. So just an announcement before we go to question and answer session. It is in continuation of the same theme or similar theme. We have Professor Dhruv Rana, a very well-known scholar of science, who's going to talk on internationalization of the sciences, India and the circulation of scientific knowledge and practice. That is coming Saturday. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for the question and answer session. I'm sure there will be some hands raised. And some... Rafat?
Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. So now question and answer session is open. So please raise your digital hand or show your interest in the chat box. So let's see, I don't see any raised hand yet, but there are some comments.
Dr. Ayaz Ahmed, there are two hands raised.
Okay, just came up. Dr. Ayaz Ahmed, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, Professor Vickers. My question is that our concern for more inclusive, more sort of revolutionary educational pedagogy on one hand, how do we square it up with this military industrial complex based in Euro-American zone, going to the new colonial regions of the world, South Asia, Africa, Middle East, etc., whereby this ethics of militant engagement and insurgency is very easily and can be very easily and has been very easily exploited by pitting one group against the other, right? In that context, this is a real dilemma. If one is promoting that there should be kind of a militant, robust social justice agenda, educational agenda within the third world countries, then they become more and more vulnerable to the mechanizations of the military industrial complex. And we have practically seen that only regimes and regions where there has been kind of a more monotheistic kind of educational pedagogy, for example, in China or Russia, where the military industrial complex has not managed to penetrate. But in other parts where this has been lacking and educational agenda has been more robust, more social justice oriented, it became vulnerable. So then how do we square? My question is, how do we square up these two concerns? On one hand, our commitment to social justice, democratic, egalitarian society and politics, but at the same time, building defenses against the military industrial complex. Yeah.
Okay. Can I briefly answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a question that sort of touches on debates that have become very sort of I was going to say prominent in Western educational circles in recent years around coloniality and the need for decolonization. I don't want to get dragged too far down, that road, but I am extremely critical of what I regard as a sort of really an obsession with decolonization, which is in turn an obsession with coloniality and a kind of sort of conspiratorial mindset that sees it everywhere. I mean, you're mentioning military-industrial complex, and I think associating it with, well, implicitly with Western colonialism. Now, I mean, there's a lot that can fairly be criticized. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's a lot to criticize in the legacy of Western colonialism. There are many ways in which that legacy is continues to be felt. And arguably, still has what you might regard as a malign influence in some respects. But I think there's a danger in emphasizing the extent of that influence and the extent of its sort of continuing malignity. Because if you overemphasize the extent of the influence of Western coloniality, what you're implicitly doing is dismissing the agency of people in societies like India, South Asia, well, Asia, Africa, everywhere apart from the West. You're implying that all power still resides in the West. And I think, it might have appeared plausible to make that kind of argument 20 years ago when America was invading Iraq and, rounding up people in Afghanistan. It's extremely hard to make that argument now. And if you want to look for a dominant military industrial complex today, I mean, actually, China's a good place to look, or Russia, especially. I mean, a military industrial complex is not a phenomenon that's exclusive to the West or to America by any means. So, yeah, and I'm not sure what that has, or to what extent, that is an issue that's really relevant to education. Although, as I said, I mean, your comments sort of relate to some extent to that broader debate on coloniality, which has become a big issue. But I'm afraid to say, to some extent, a distraction.
If I could briefly, I mean, not just the coloniality, but also the neocolonial interventions, especially what we have seen. You pointed out Middle East, but recent times, as we talk, you said 20 years back, but as we talk, Bangladesh, we have seen regime change operation. Pakistan, Ukraine is the shining example of this whole, liberal sort of social justice education. And then, the whole Euro-American military-industrial complex coming down, and then, Russia responding. So it is in this present rather than in the past,
Right.
coloniality and
Yeah, I'm going to have to stop you there.
neo-coloniality.
I'm going to have to stop you because we're getting into weird conspiracy theory territory now. Because, the Ukraine war, I mean, the background to it, admittedly, is complex, but it's not been caused by some
Let's
sort
move
of
on.
malign
Let's move
Western
on.
conspiracy. It's been caused by Russia.
Let's move on, please.
Thank you both. So there is a comment. Okay, your talk is running parallel to what happened in the US, for instance, in Colombia. Who took what from what playbook? Whose playbook? Any comment on that?
Sorry, it's running parallel to
what is happening in the US, for instance, in Columbia University.
Oh.
Who took what from whose playbook? Who is playing it?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question because, of course, I mean, insofar as I was discussing the educational policies of the BJP government. Of course, the BJP have been in power longer than Donald. I mean, prior to Donald Trump's first term in America. I don't think there's a huge amount of influence in terms of politics. I don't think there's a huge amount of cross-fertilization between Indian and American politics. I'm not sure about that. But in terms of what I was saying about things like social and emotional learning, neuroscience, psychology, AI, of course, that there is huge sort of mutual influence, and a lot of this stuff has I mean, certainly a lot of the investment in lab-based neuroscience and so-called educational neuroscience has been happening in America.
That's good enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Nazir Ahmad, please.
Yes. My question relates to the inevitable tension between education for the individual, education as needed by the state in a global paradigm of economic centration. As far as the individual is concerned, the goal ought to be the development of not just the mind, but also the heart, the body, and the ability to make a living in a competitive world. Then the state has its own requirements to survive, especially in a paradigm where there is no morality in state-to-state relations. And then the economic centration. Technology is always there, inevitable. AI is here, whether or not we like it, and it's going to affect the individual, the state, as well as the global paradigm. So, sir, my question is, how do you balance these things in this kind of a global, fast-moving world?
Yeah. Well, yes, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I mean, states fundamentally, why do they exist, or why do they deserve to exist? They exist to provide us with security. Do they exist for their own sake? I mean, I think, we need to beware of treating states as if they're sort of entities on a par with, people. You mentioned that, AI is sort of here to stay. We can't deny it. We can't avoid it. Somehow education needs to engage with it. I think that's true. I think we do have to, recognize the existence of AI and, digital technologies, and we need to equip young people to deal with them. But when you look at a lot of the discourse around the implications of AI and technology for education, it's often presented as a kind of challenge to humans. So Andreas Schleicher, who's the sort of education supremo at the OECD, came out a few years ago where he said, if we're not, I think it was something like, if we're not first rate, if education systems don't, produce first rate humans, we're going to end up as second rate robots. In other words, he's presenting this vision of humans as if we're in a kind of race with the robots. If we don't run faster, if we don't up our game, the robot's going to overtake us. Well, that doesn't make me particularly keen on embracing AI and technology. But I mean, I think it's also if you stop to think about it, a very weird and disturbing way to think about the implications of technology. I mean, AI is extraordinarily powerful. And a lot of the technology we have today is extraordinarily powerful. But it reminds me of John Maynard Keynes, speculating in the 1930s about how in sort of, 50, 80 years time, we'd all be working sort of 4-hour days or 3-day weeks, because technology would have advanced so far that we wouldn't have to work so much anymore in order to sort of maintain our existing standard of living. So we'd have lots of time for doing the sorts of things that he enjoyed, like going to the ballet, or playing the piano, or reading books, or chatting with our friends, or various pastimes. That's not what's happened. I mean, as technology has advanced, we've found ourselves, more harassed, more overworked. Inequality has massively spiraled. So when we think about, the role of the state in all of this, I mean, the state is clearly failing in a crucial respect, which is to manage the problem of distributing fairly the benefits of these technological advances. So, I mean, that's not particularly sort of related to education, and I'm not sure that it really answers your question, but
Thank you. Richa, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Hello, Edward. Well, you have put in a very nice picture behind your presentation. It's connected with the nature. And in your talk, you had included a few words like mindfulness, gratitude, and happiness that you see in the Indian curriculum. State-wise, it is implemented by different governments, and the government is run by the different political parties. How do you see this change? As earlier, when we have came up with education in 64 or 86 policy and all, that time we were always talking about holistic education. Is it like we have shifted more towards industrialized society that is going away from nature? Or is it like we are not that socialized or more connected with the people. We have a very individualistic society that we actually need these kinds of things now in our curriculum. How do you see the change as compared to the world over education system? World over, there is a criticism on AI. World over, there is a influence of AI. That's another thing. But how do you see the change in Indian context, sir?
Right. I mean, that's a very good question. I'm not sure how qualified I really am to answer it. But of course, when you refer to those earlier national education policies in the 1960s and 1980s, those are, very much from the, the days before the quite dramatic liberalization of the Indian economy in the 1990s. And those are sort of also, of course, the relatively early decades following independence, where you still had a sort of lingering influence of these Gandhian ideas in amongst Indian elites. So I think to some extent those ideas were reflected in those earlier documents. But I hesitate to use the word hypocrisy, but there is also a sort of uncomfortable, context or reality that we have to bear in mind in looking at those documents, which is, of course, that was an era when, behind what you might regard as a sort of idealistic rhetoric in those documents, the hard reality is of a country where, vast proportions of children were actually not receiving really any meaningful education at all. And then in the post-1990s period, what do we see? We see actually quite a rapid advance in access to basic education. But at the same time, we see a kind of narrowing of the vision of what that education should or could be for. And also, I think in the post-1990s era, what you've also seen in India is an accelerating withdrawal of elites from the public education system. So, I mean, there's always been a sort of, sector of what I like to call Harry Potter schools in India, sort of, the Dune schools, the La Martinières and so forth, these schools modeled on English public schools, private schools, there's always been that sector around, but that's mushroomed since the 1990s. And you've also seen more and more wealthier Indians, if they can, sort of look to get their kids to college in North America or Australia or outside India, or to new private universities within India. And so, the more that the Indian state has actually managed to expand educational access to underprivileged groups since the 1990s, the more privileged groups have exited the system. And, that has contributed to this sort of bifurcation that I was talking about in my lecture earlier, and this sort of narrowing of the focus of a public education system that now is basically seen as for the masses. Does that make sense?
So don't you think that we are actually using the market to sell the product, which may be ESL or which may be happiness or mindfulness?
We're using markets, well, yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, the promotion of these things is very much connected with marketization. Yeah, very much.
Thank you. Dr. Syed Amr, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vickers. Very erudite talk. And I have an abstract question. you have very nicely presented Gandhian values in the context of neuroscience. What I wonder is, on the face of this, it seems that the nature of very erudite nature of your talk and the values you have espoused is antithetical to what Mahatma Gandhi taught. As you know, and you mentioned yourself, he was mostly going to the basics and going to the villages, and to degree of sophistication which you brought in your talk, whether Mahatma Gandhi will be quite happy with that. I mean, just a speculation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say I'm a selective admirer of Gandhi's ideas, probably not a consistent one. I mean, of course, yes, Gandhi very much emphasized the role of craft in education, and yeah, the role of sort of working with your hands.
Yes.
And very much sort of community-based model of schooling. And I think there's a lot that's good in that, but I mean, I'm not sure. It's very difficult to know what Gandhi would have made, well, precisely what he would have made of things like computers and AI and all of that. I mean, we can strongly suspect he would not have been in favor of any of that. But you know, as we were just discussing, I mean, we're confronted with a world where it's really very difficult to escape that, you know, where mobile phones are widely used in every Indian village, really, now. And so, I mean, we're faced with the question of how you deal with a very different sort of world, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, whether there's any going back or whether we would want to go back to the sort of rural economy that Gandhi, in a sense, idealized. Yeah, is I guess the question that you're getting at. And I'm skeptical on that score. I think, you know, Gandhi's someone who's quite heavily influenced, of course, by people like Ruskin, by sort of romantic opponents to modern, you know, industrial modernity. But it's very difficult to find societies where people volunteer to sort of remain in the village rather than, you know, heading for the bright lights in the big city. And so I think realistically, we're faced with the challenge of sort of mitigating some of the, you know, alienating and environmentally, socially harmful consequences of that movement.
Yeah.
And I suppose Gandhi's response to that would have been, well, what, or partly, in part, would have been, actually, what we do need is to attend to people's sort of inner lives. So he would not have been, I mean, he certainly wasn't entirely opposed to a sort of inward-looking aspect to education. But I think the key difference with Gandhi is that the sort of spiritual aspect of education, I think, as he would have seen it, and that word spiritual is not one that we see associated with things like social and emotional learning, but that spiritual aspect of education for him, I think, was very important, but was always associated with a quite consciously political awareness, and that's also missing from.
Thank you, Dr. Vickers. So there is a comment, question, okay, from Harpreet. Thank you for your talk. I could now understand the topic well, especially rebranding, to which I frowned at initially. How do you see the mindfulness, meditation, or happiness as enhancing human agency to fight for equality? Or do we see downfall of psychology being played at the hands of economics and political ideologue.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about things like mindfulness, meditation, these are practices that on an individual level can be helpful, I think. But where I worry about them is when they are, in a sense, I suppose, sort of oversold as a solution to wider societal problems, or when they become a way of basically distracting us from the need for collective action to address problems that we can only address together. I mean, however much I meditate or however much I enhance my mindfulness, that's not going to stop global heating. Or it's not going to stop the war in Ukraine, or it's not going to actually do anything about social inequality or social injustice in my society. It might make me feel better, and that's not something to be dismissed. I like to feel better. It might help me to reflect more dispassionately on some of these problems, and thereby perhaps indirectly contribute to, you know, enabling us to come up with better ways of managing our affairs. But I think we have to be modest in our, when we discuss or promote the benefits of things like mindfulness and meditation and so forth. I mean, that's just my personal view.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vickers. Another question from Q-Slam. There is a lot of rhetoric and policies around transformative education through global citizenship. Education, even UNESCO promotes GCE too, but how and why countries operationalize this as per their mandate is concerning to future of society in absence of any ethical consideration. Any comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely got that. So GCE is global citizenship education.
Yeah.
And yes, UNESCO is promoting that, but how
and why countries operationalize this as per their mandate?
Well, I mean, some countries or some governments are really not very keen on global citizenship education, would rather not talk about it in those terms. So the Chinese government, for example, doesn't like the term global citizenship education. They quite like to talk about peace education, but not global citizenship education. And the reason for that is that in their view, and I think in the view of many perhaps more authoritarian states, global citizenship, talk of global citizenship implies some sort of political loyalty beyond the nation state. Yeah, because if you're a citizen, you're a citizen of somewhere. But if you're a global citizen, where are you a citizen of, actually? Do you have loyalties that transcend the nation state? Because if you do, the Chinese government wants to know about them. Yeah. And stamp them out, basically. So they're not particularly keen on that, and they're not the only ones. So they'll prefer to talk about peace education. But then what do they mean when they talk about peace education? Well, there again, we come increasingly, if you look into what is promoted under the banner of peace education, we come back to this whole sort of raft of ideas associated with social and emotional learning and psychology. Because increasingly what's being promoted as peace education is what amounts to pacification of the individual. So it's a sort of depoliticized approach. And I mean, I saw this recently because I've actually been involved in a project looking at Sri Lanka and looking at aspects of the education system and public history in Sri Lanka after the Civil War. And I was looking at civics textbooks, and you know, as you would expect in a country like Sri Lanka, there is a substantial section of the civics textbooks that discusses conflict. But when you look at how they discuss conflict in those books, they don't actually talk about, the concrete sources of conflict within Sri Lankan society. They start from the level of the individual and they say conflict begins within the individual. Sometimes you feel angry, don't you? With your friends, or with yourself. I mean, I can't remember the exact the way that the narrative develops, but it's a very sort of psychologizing and individualizing approach to conflict, which very much reflects these trends that we see in debates over social and emotional learning. And while in a society like Sri Lanka that's only very relatively recently emerged from conflict, you can see some reasons for being very cautious about raking over the ashes of that conflict in the school curriculum. But serious questions, I think, need to be raised about whether focusing on individuals and not really facing up to some of the causes of that conflict in terms of relations between ethno-religious communities and again social inequality, focusing rather than focusing on them, focusing on individuals and individuals' sort of mental states. That's I think a troubling trend that we see in many countries.
Thank you, Professor. That concludes the question and answer session. Before I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin, thank you once again. It has been a wonderful session. I learned a lot. And thank you, Dr. Hussain, Jawad Hussain. Thank you so much for the introduction. And back to Dr. Raziuddin.
Wonderful session. I have just one question. Have you, while doing all these education-related projects, have you come across Dr. Zakir Hussain's Nai Talim, which was called the Basic National Education Policy that Congress adopted at the around 50 in 40s with Gandhiji's blessing? That was basically to provide universal education in a more holistic way in India. And I wonder how often when Nehru, the closest disciple of Mahatma, quite often distanced himself from Mahatma's thinking on modernity and on modernizing India and all those. But Nehru himself, who established so many really great things in India, but he miserably failed in providing or adopting this policy of Zakir Hussain for providing primary education to large masses of India. I mean, why he himself was so rash. I mean, the most rational person in India at the time, who was thinking in the more scientific term, he should have known that if you are not providing primary education to the large masses, only an elite section will rise up in India, which can somehow manage the Indian industry or the infrastructure, but it cannot sustain very strongly unless the masses are getting more and more better education. So did you come across this or ever thought about it?
I know of Zakir Hussain, but I'm not familiar with that particular document. But it's often been observed that, you know, one of the reasons for India's relatively slow economic development post-independence, I mean, one of the major factors is the failure to extend basic education to the masses of the population. And I mean, it's a big contrast between what we see in South Asia and what we see in East Asia. In, you know, particularly in the sort of the period of rapid economic development in East Asia, that's driven by you know, the successful rollout of universal basic education in those countries. Certainly in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, in the early post-war decades, but China also. I mean, by the 1970s, and this is one of the underappreciated. I hesitate to use the word achievement, but it was an achievement of the Maoist era, actually. That by the 1970s, China's population actually did have a significantly higher level of basic education than India's did, which is one of the reasons why, you know, China was able to develop very rapidly from the 1980s onwards economically, well, particularly from the 90s. I mean, China's record's by no means perfect, and by nowhere near as impressive as that of, you know, the smaller East Asian societies, but considerably more than India, and partly for that reason. I mean, as to why Nehru didn't prioritize basic education more, I can't really answer that one.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, you know, in theory he would have liked to, but
I don't know. I mean, I'm clueless about it.
no, I mean, but I mean, given, you know, every leader has a limited amount of political capital, and in post-independence India, the government was faced with very powerful interests that really opposed the rollout of basic education to the masses because they saw it and still see it as threatening their power.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this classic work of historical sociology called "The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy" by Barrington Moore Jr. It's published in, I think, 1966, where he sort of says, you know, Indian democracy, it's not really going to work because you know, the basically that he's arguing that in order to have a functioning democracy, you need to have a revolution first. And India's, so, I mean, he starts this book with a chapter on England called the basically, you know, the basic tracing the origins of British representative government to the violence of the English Civil War. And so, you know, this theme continues through the book, and he gets to India. He says, well, the problem with India is that okay, there was an independent struggle, but there wasn't enough of a struggle because it didn't overturn the, you know, key elements of the existing social order. Because what you also have in East Asia after the war, and it happens in very different ways in China as compared with Japan or Taiwan and South Korea, but what you have is land reform and redistribution of land to the tiller. And that's also key in forming the basis for, not so much in China, but in other parts of East Asia, a sort of relatively broad-based and evenly distributed form of economic growth. But that land reform never happened in India either, and Nehru didn't feel able to push it through against powerful
To some extent they did, but not really powerfully enough to push it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Really, that concludes this session. This was a wonderful session. Perhaps a lot of people who are from the education, you know, background I see them here. Perhaps they have learned more. They are going to put some ideas of their own in the classes. We are just a learner here in different fields and all this. Thank you so much. And sorry for being, participating so late from Japan.
Well, I don't have to get up early tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Vickers. So you brought a good point that democracy need a revolution. So I have to read about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I mean,
Yeah, because
revolutions are pretty horrible.
I'm thinking India's democracy is working, whatever the
when you say
drawbacks
revolution,
are.
most revolutions are violent. Very rarely revolutions are passive. They are more. They will. They bring more upheaval, and then a period of after that stability, or then again a dictatorship of another kind.
Yeah.
Maybe we consider the partition as a
I mean, China and Russia are the shining examples. They brought revolution.
Yeah, if shining is the right word.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vickers. So wonderful.
Wonderful session. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Okay, now bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Rafat, you are in time.
Thank you, because you didn't have the concluding remarks, so that saved some time.
I did, but it was short. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.